Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's good to be here with all you people. So, yes, it's lovely and sunny outside. So that's where some people are. And there are the other two sessions. But what we want to look at for my part of this is the effect of the local context on the flourishing church, as it says there, which I think is a really interesting thing. It arises really out of the work that the Church Army Research Unit has done with lots of church planting and resource churches and other examples over several years, and sometimes we're often brought in to assess how well it has gone. Usually the funders say we want an assessment to see how well the money's been spent and all that, and that's where we often come in to give an assessment, and that often relates obviously to the context. And some very interesting observations I think have arisen from all of that. I want to start with a question really to you all, and that is, when do you think in the last 200 years the church was most flourishing? No really right answer here, but I want to know when you would say. You can give me a decade or a year in the last 200 years when the church was most flourishing. I'm actually a bit of a historian, church historian. This is the kind of question I really like to ask.
1990.
Oh, well done. You're almost like a plant, aren't you? The year, and of course the answer depends on how you measure it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's really what the answer is. So you're going to measure it through how well the church is expanding, how many churches are being founded, how many new churches are being built. You're going to measure it on vocations and things like that. Well, the answer, of course, is 1888. Don't. Because 1888 is the year that the Church of England ordained more curates than ever before and ever since. Okay? 1888, when they ordained most curates in the Church of England. Now, obviously, I'm limiting it to the Church of England. I'm limiting it to ordination. I'm limiting it to that particular vocation. But that's one way of measuring it. And you'd also, if you looked at around 1888, was a time when more parishes were being created in this country. Lots of churches have been built. So many are built in that period up to 1888. And in a measure of saying, is the church flourishing? It seemed to be doing really well. In terms of wealth, the church was probably at its most wealthy. And most of the wealth, interestingly, was centred at the parish level, not at diocese or national. It was mostly at the parish level. There was a great difference between parishes, but some were extraordinarily wealthy and founded churches because of that. So looking at it that sense, that is when the church perhaps was most flourishing. However, statistics don't tell the whole story. Okay? Is also a time when the church was not reaching certain parts of the country. And although the church was increasing in number, and it was right up until the 1890s, the population of the country was also rising, and it was rising at a higher rate than the size of the church. So the population in this country actually between 1830 and 1900 trebled, okay? Went from about 10 million to 30 million. But the membership of the church didn't treble, it perhaps doubled, okay? But there's a difference there. Actually, the population increasing, but the size of the church not increasing at the same pace. Because you could say the church was actually decreasing at that time, if you looked at the statistics. And some people were really quite worried about the way the church wasn't reaching certain groups of people. They talked in those days about the urban poor. They talked about the working man. They talked about the industrial areas, which were sort of being very much created in some of the towns and the cities and the great conurbations that were happening. And they were saying the church wasn't reaching all those people. And there was one man in particular who said the church wasn't reaching people on the streets. Now, who would have that been? Eddie's going to give me the answer to this one as well.
Wilson Carlyle.
Wilson Carlyle, who's the founder of Church Army, and he founded it in the year 1882. Very much at the same time as people were thinking of the church as flourishing, it was not reaching all people, particularly those on the margins of society. And so things like the Church Army and the Salvation Army were created to try and reach people in other places. So you could say the church was flourishing, but it wasn't reaching all parts, and it very much depended where those people were at the time. So the question, therefore, is the church is flourishing, but it doesn't flourish in all places. And as much as that was true in 1880s, it's true today. And actually, the context of where a person is or where a community is or what makes up that community does affect whether the church will flourish or not. And that's what I'm proposing to say to you today. And I would say that the context affects actually what you do, how you do it, and from my point of view, really quite interesting, how you measure flourishing as well. So what you do, how you do it, and how you measure it one way or another. And that is quite interesting. So as a research unit, we've been looking at different cases of planting churches, of grafting churches, of resource churches of one sort or another. And we have managed to see quite a difference that is determined by the context of where those places are. The kind of places that I'm talking about particularly are the urban estates or the outer urban estates, of which there are lots of examples in this country, of course, where the church is not flourishing, where indeed an estate was probably built in the 1930s or the 50s onwards. And in the early periods, there might have been a church actually built within that community. That didn't happen in the later housing developments, but it did in the early years. But that church now very much failing in terms of measurement, in terms of people and financial sustainability. Plenty of examples of that we can talk about. But the other kind of area is the sort of medium to large post-industrial towns. Sometimes if you look on, the Sunday Times or something, there's a list of all the least places you'd want to live in England. Well, that's where you'd see some of these places where there had been a major industry that's gone. And there's nothing really sustaining economically the community. It's lost a lot of its prestige that it might have had once and has become a place people don't want to live in. Often, small to medium large towns in this country. And the statistics of those two particular kinds of contexts tell us that the people there have particular characteristics. They tend to be younger, interestingly, younger than the population at large, or within the nation or the diocese. They tend to have health outcomes that are considered worse. So if you ask them, and it's subjective, but if you ask them how healthy they feel, it's usually on the spectrum towards I don't feel very well and I don't have a good health outlook. They tend to be lone occupants, so living on their own, a higher percentage in these areas than in other places. And they also tend to be within those top 10% of deprived areas in the country. So, we have a standard map. We're all familiar, I think, with the way you can measure deprivation in this country. The government does it systematically. It has various variables of deprivation. They call them multiple deprivations, and they come up with areas in the country which are within those scales, and it's the darker ones that are the most deprived. And it's not just urban areas, of course, it includes some of the rural areas as well. And the other feature that I think is a bit more subjective about these areas is the reputation that they have. Okay, don't go there. Don't go to that estate. It's a sink estate. Don't go to that town. There's no hope there. And visiting those places, it's something that people talk about straight away. Is this place is badly known, and sometimes almost a bit of a pride for the fact that it is known for certain things. And it may not be true, statistically true, that it is a place of knife crime or other things like that, but they do have perhaps a reputation of one sort or another. Now, I mentioned the context because I think it's important when the church, and it does often said, we want to plant a church in one of those particular areas within, say, the top 10% of most deprived in the country. How are they going to judge that they're going to be successful in our area? And how are we going to measure it 5 or 10 years on? And I think that's quite important to know. And there's, for my mind, 3 particular areas where we can talk about how successful that church plant has been. The first of those is going to be leadership. Now, it's a feature that we find when we go to assess these church plants is that often the leadership is brought in from outside. Sometimes brought in a way that shows this leadership has shown it's competent, but in a very different context. Okay, so I'm going to contrast the areas I'm talking about with the areas where church plants may be successful, and I'm going to say, and I'm going to be, characterize them as the sort of western suburbs, which are affluent, or the city centres where there's a strong student population. Now, sometimes a person who has done well in developing, planting and growing a church in those areas is then taken or feels called to go to one of the areas I'm talking about, and they're like injecting their leadership style, and they sometimes bring a team with them as well, their family and loads of friends, in order to lead a church, which may have very few people in at the moment, and anybody, into success. I think that that is problematic, very problematic, when it's brought in from outside. People will say, oh, but we really want to grow local leadership, without appreciating the difference of what local leadership might look like. And often it's very different. It's not usually something that has the same qualities or features of the leadership that is brought in. You know, the way you run a church in some parts of the country is not going to be the way you run a church in another, in terms of committees or scrutiny or democracy, all those kind of things that we think are essential to running a church may not apply to other contexts. And it's in the local leadership, the kind of areas I'm talking about, that you might have a different kind of leadership that has an informal authority, yeah, that might be more charismatic in the sense of sociologically charismatic in drawing people to themselves. It might have some connection with long-standing attitudes within that community, alliances, sometimes linked to differences of one sort or another. Now, none of that's a value judgment. It's saying the leadership is quite different often in those places, but we are transporting in a different leadership into those contexts, which is problematical. And it comes down to the theological point about being incarnational and how important that is. There's a current debate, is there not, in the Church of England about what is called working class leadership, and a great need for that. And I think it's expressed as much as anywhere in these kind of contexts where people of that particular social background need to be the leaders if they're going to be leaders of churches in those places, one sort or another. To be historical for a moment, there was a great feature in the 19th century of what were called gentlemen curates, and they would be sent to the slums, okay? And they would work really hard. They might even dedicate their whole lives to those areas. It's questionable how good they were at their work, though some were. But the very good thing about those gentlemen curates was that they cost nothing. They were from families that could afford to send their children, their sons, to those places and finance the whole thing. So the church didn't pay for them at all. They were free. Okay, some, as I say, were successful, but usually those who lasted a long time, and those who, in the end, perhaps in a more deferential era, were respected by the local communities, one sort or another. Are we in danger? And we look at that and think, well, how can anybody believe in that system? But are we in danger of doing a similar thing in our own age? The second thing I want to look very quickly at is discipleship. What are the models of discipleship that we think are appropriate for some of the kind of areas I'm talking about? And I'm arguing that the local context does affect what model of discipleship you might be working with. So what would work in a very simplistic way or an unreal way with an 18 to 21-year-old student will not work with a single mother living on a housing estate, will not work with a person struggling with abuse of one sort or another, will not work with an unemployed youngster whose parents and grandparents never had a proper job. Very different. And the stories that we hear in the research that we do is how people, don't progress nicely along this discipleship pattern of, becoming a Christian, then growing, becoming, even greater and stronger Christian, often are coming back and are slipping back. However, funders often ask the question, and this is a terrible question, they often ask the question, how many disciples have you made? There's something wrong with that question, isn't there? How many disciples have you made? Well, we don't make any disciples, do we? Only God makes disciples. But funders are saying, give us the number. You've got to make 20 this year, 40 the next, 60 the next, and 80 the next. I've seen that in STF bids, and how unrealistic it is, and how sometimes those who are having to fill in the forms are saying, well, is that person a Christian? Maybe they were a Christian last year. Are they still a Christian? actually filling in the forms to meet what the funders want, because it's an unrealistic expectation and it's a misunderstanding of how people's lives are like in some of these particular contexts that I'm talking about. So I think we need a different way of looking at growth in discipleship and the complex lives that people have. Sometimes we use the term chaotic life. I've heard that a lot of times about people who live in some of these contexts, as if to say their life is not simple. It's much more dependent on things like employment, housing, and health than what would be important for other people. And I've also seen that a measure of discipleship is given in house groups. Okay, now you can tell me what the percentage of people in your church should be in a house church. It should be in a house group. It is a magic percentage that I've seen in so many funding applications. It's not 100%, because you're not got everyone to go to the house group. What is the percentage? Thank you. That's close enough. 60%. Well done. I've seen it that you've got to achieve that 60% in a house group, and a traditional kind of house group, which is very difficult in a context where people are not used to inviting strangers into their homes. It's not the done thing. It's a bit weird, a bit odd, and they might, yes, meet on church premises, but maybe that doesn't qualify for what is being said. So funders often ask that question and put it down as a measure of success without understanding the particular context in which they are found. So, and my third and final little area to think about is about financial sustainability. Every funding application I've seen makes the assumption that in 5 years, this will be self-financing and it'll be lovely. You can just leave it and it'll get on with itself. Now, that's unrealistic. Even the people who make the applications, even those who read the applications, don't really believe that's going to happen in every case. But it's there nevertheless. And people think that, okay, we inject this money for 5 years, 10 years if you're lucky, and then we'll have a self-sustaining church. It's been planted and now not only pays for itself, but hopefully pays a little bit into the diocese as well. Okay. And sometimes this is expressed very crudely in the monthly standing order. Now, I don't know how many monthly standing orders you have. I would suggest that people live in chaotic lives, who live very much catch hand mouth, who don't know where their regular income is coming from, do not have monthly standing orders. So to request that your congregation that you've planted will within 5 years be, 50% of people committing regularly through the standing order is not going to work at all. But that's not to say that people in these contexts are not generous. They are certainly very generous with what they have. They have different ways of being generous. They will respond to those one-off appeals very generously. They will respond in kind, often in food and things like that, and in practical help. I have my own experience of where they will come and mend things and provide things in a way that is really quite extraordinary. And they will give, most importantly, of their time. And that might be the greatest gift of all. So forget the standing order, I'd say. Think about how much time people are giving. And there are certain schemes set up in certain churches where people can give of time and receive something back for that, which I think is good. But that's responding to that particular context. So can we expect churches in these kind of places to become self-sustaining at any point? Or, and that might be an expectation of the funders and the diocese, or do we think we're always going to need to invest in those places because they have something special to say to us as a wider church? So, just to summarize, when we are thinking of what we've already done and what we hope to do in planting churches in some particular contexts, then we need to think about those particular areas where how you measure success may well be quite different. So in leadership, and whether you can grow truly local leadership, what does that look like? In what pathways of discipleship look like? And in what are realistic financial sustainability models of one sort or another. I think it's the sort of thing we've been learning for a long time, and I think it's something that the church will carry on learning for a long time to come as well. Thank you.